Have you been surprised by what has taken place over the past year and a half or so, or 2 years almost?
No, I haven't been surprised. At the initial stages of the war, I remember hearing people thinking, oh, it's going to be done in a month, 2 months. They're going to set up a client state in the Donbass and that'll be it. And I was like, either you don't know Ukrainians or you don't know Russians if you think it's going to be a short-term war. I still think it's going to be a long, drawn-out war. It's going to be a war of attrition, even with the destabilizing or allegedly destabilizing events over the past weekend. We haven't seen really any Russian let up. So if the sides are Ukraine will not give up a single inch of Ukrainian territory and Russia wants to keep the Donbass, you're going to have a conflict until either one of those positions changes. So no, I don't think we're going to see a quick end. So yeah, this isn't unexpected to me.
And just to remind people, you spent a significant amount of time in Ukraine and prior to the war, right? In the years leading up there, and doing your research and academic work. Is it your sense that the United States is inhibiting obviously, United States is providing a lot of military equipment and money to sustain the Ukrainian war effort. And so, someone could say like, well, the U.S. is enabling Ukrainians in that way. But is it your sense that the U.S. is in any way inhibiting any inclination by Ukrainians, if it exists, to come to a negotiated settlement with Russia?
I don't think so. And I think, we know that the Ukrainians are getting tons of financial and military aid from the United States. But even if the United States wasn't giving this aid, Ukraine would still fight. I mean, we saw the farmers with the tractors, trying to take Russian tanks early on. And I think that's something important to understand. And even if the United States declines and decreases its military aid, which the GOP is interested in, that doesn't mean that its Western allies are going to also follow. It's particularly the Baltics and Poland. I very much doubt that either one of those sides are going to stop helping Ukraine. So I think it's also important to remember that the United States isn't the central actor here. It's not the key power player in terms of how things are going to turn out. But I think it'd probably be in the United States' interest. They would probably want to see a negotiated settlement because it means the Republican talking points are gone about the United States continuing to support Ukraine. So I don't think the United States is the determinative factor of how long the Ukrainians are going to fight. The Ukrainians are going to fight to the last Ukrainian because they saw it happen in 2014. I mean, you have to keep fighting or the Russian occupation is going to continue.
Well, this was in the midst of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, right, where they were beginning to take back territory. What's the significance of that in regards to this Wagner attempted mutiny or whatever the heck we saw over the weekend?
I love that. It's whatever the heck. We know it's not a coup. It's a mutiny, insurrection, march for justice, whatever Prigozhin's calling it. I actually, in terms of my lens of understanding why it happened at the time it did, to me, it's less because of the Ukrainian offensive and more because of the deadline that the Ministry of Defense put on Wagner to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. So I think if we look at what's happened in the past 48 hours, it doesn't seem like Ukraine has made that much. I don't think that the Prigozhin insurrection helped Ukraine that much when you think about it. We still see shelling at Kherson and Kiev. They made about 1,000 meters of progress towards Bakhmut, but that's not that significant. So I think it's less the timing of the Ukrainian offensive and more the timing of the deadline that the Ministry of Defense gave Prigozhin.
All right, well, let's go back and get everybody on the same page because I imagine a lot of people have heard about the Wagner Group for the first time. Is it Wagner or Wagner?
If you want to put on a German accent, it's Wagner. Allegedly, Prigozhin named it after Richard Wagner, the German composer, or Wagner. As long as you know who we're talking about, either one I think is good.
I always like to do a German accent whenever I can. So, go back because the real, the Wagner Group has been there, but really they seem to sort of like get highlighted in the fight in Bakhmut. At least I think for like sort of popular, but give us a sense of what this is and where it fits in the context, because we have a Wagner Group and I don't know what the the most recent name of it is, but it was Blackwater back during Iraq. And then it became Jay, and now I don't know what the Prince is calling it. But I imagine we have other groups that aren't quite as sort of flashy, but essentially mercenary armies. But the Wagner Group, where they get their mercenaries from, is sort of special. It seems like.
It is very special. So the Wagner Group, we've really been hearing about them since the 2014 initial Russian incursions into the Donbass. And so when you think about the little green men we heard about in Crimea and in Luhansk and Donetsk, they were kind of part of that. And really what we saw were these early reports of Wagner in 2014, but Prigozhin wasn't necessarily connected to them. And now, by 2022, Wagner and Prigozhin are kind of household names. So they're not just operating in Ukraine, they're operating in Libya, Syria, but also throughout the African continent. And so if you think about it, the Wagner Group, because they're a private mercenary group, they can do things that aren't necessarily directly tied back to the Russian state. We've seen this a lot on the African continent. Wagner has been accused of atrocious crimes, including mass sexual assaults against women in the Central African Republic. And when people complain, like the UN or the internet, the Human Rights Commission, when they complain to Russia, Russia's like, well, they don't work for us. They're not, a state military capacity. Although we know in Russia, if you have a private mercenary group without Putin's consent, you don't tend to live very long. So the Wagner Group, what they've been able to do is kind of be the most powerful mercenaries, and they're incredibly well trained. They're better trained than the Russian military. But what happened was the war of Ukraine, they've suffered a lot of casualties. And so Prigozhin has a very interesting idea. What if you take people from prisons and train them to be armed killers and then let them loose in Ukraine and the Central African Republic, among others? And that's what's happened. I think I've seen numbers of up to 20,000 of Wagner's troops are people from Russian prison colonies and prison camps who have been recruited. And what happens is, I think this happened last week, actually, where Putin signed a decree saying if you fought for Wagner and you were in prison, once you finish fighting, you're free. You are out of prison. And this is not just people who've committed petty crimes. These are people who have committed murders, who've committed violent felonies, who have been released, fought for Wagner. So
we should say this is all based upon if I remember correctly, the movie The Dirty Dozen with Lee Marvin, where he had a squad of people left from prison.
Well, also isn't Prigozhin a former prisoner as well?
I mean, he has one of the best, criminal CVs you could find in Russia. And people make fun of him because he used to operate a hot dog stand. Hot dog stands, food stands like that in the late 90s, it's money laundering. It's a front for money laundering. So, he's a well-versed criminal, and he really tapped into something where you have this large prison population. The Russian state doesn't want to feed them, doesn't want to pay for them. So you recruit them, you arm them, and they go fight because what else do they have to lose? And then when you finish fighting, you're free. So what we've seen in Ukraine in particular are the use of these troops. But what's interesting to me has been the two high-profile cases of two African nationals who were imprisoned in Russia who have been killed in action while fighting for Wagner. One was from the Zambia, and I think one was from Ghana. And so now you have the situation of not only is Prigozhin running his own private mercenary group, and he's been running it for a very long time. Around early winter, we saw him publicly dogging out Shoigu and Gerasimov, like the general staff of the Russian military. He's constantly talking about them and dogging them out. And that was really surprising. But the killing of these two African nationals also puts heat on Russia, because these African states want to know, how do these African nationals even end up in Ukraine? So you have a lot of different pressure points kind of operating with Wagner's, very strange way of recruiting people.
And we should just say, Sergei Shoigu, I think is how you pronounce it, or I don't know, you tell me, is the defense minister, and Valery Gerasimov is the commander of Russia's army in Ukraine. And so I guess basically like Colin Powell and Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, I guess maybe are the equivalent. And so Wagner's having issues with them, and what is the nature of the criticism been? Is he not getting enough support? Was Bakhmut? Because my always understanding of Bakhmut too was that nobody seemed to think that there was, and maybe this is an incorrect reading on my part, but nobody seemed to think that there was as big of a strategic or tactical advantage in controlling that city as it was sort of like almost a mental one, or or emotional one or something. Can you outline that? Like, where did this criticism begin, or what started it?
So Prigozhin's big complaints against Shoigu and Gerasimov have been the lack of support for Wagner troops, but also seeing the disarray and the poor training of Russian troops on the ground in places like Bakhmut and throughout the Donbass. And it's also, and you see him, so during his March for Justice, when they captured Rostov-on-Don and the Southern Military District Command, you see him berating in this video he released. He's berating the military commander of the Southern District Command, Yevkurov. And in the video, he's yelling at him and he's talking about respect. He's saying like the constant disrespect that Wagner gets and how people don't recognize how important Wagner's been to Russian success in the Donbass. So I think that's the important key for understanding Prigozhin. It's like, it's not just we're not getting support and you're sending out these poorly trained guys, but it's also you're not putting respect on what we've done and how many people we've lost to continue to hold Bakhmut. And I think that's the thing, is Bakhmut isn't necessarily strategically important, but it does hold a lot of moral importance and ethical importance to Ukrainians and also to Russians. I mean, when you think about like, why are we fighting over this region that isn't necessarily, or this particular administrative center that doesn't have that much strategic influence, I think it's because of what it's become and what it's meant to Ukrainians and to Russians. But I mean, Bakhmut's also been important for Wagner. That's where a lot of Wagner forces have been based. So that's kind of why it's important, but really his complaints, and he hasn't made a complaint against Putin. I think that's something important that people remember. It's been against the general staff of the Ministry of Defense not recognizing how important Wagner is. But also his key argument is we don't want to be under the Ministry of Defense because look at how bad you've screwed up Ukraine already. Why would we want to be put under the Ministry of Defense's control?
So okay, so the Wagner, and we're talking about 25,000 troops. They were fighting they were the tip of the spear in Bakhmut. They take Bakhmut along with other Russian forces, I guess. Russian forces then sort of hold the city. Wagner goes back to the rear, essentially, probably to rest, right? And then these contracts come up. So what was Prigozhin, like, what was his idea? It sounds like almost like he was like running almost like a political campaign to woo the Russian public so that he had some type of leverage in this negotiation. I mean, it's almost like I don't know, like an athlete not showing up to spring training camp or something.
That's actually a good way to put it. And I love that you put it that way, because we've seen, I mean, on social media, like I was getting on a plane to fly back to Houston when everything started happening. And I didn't have internet access for an hour. I'm like, oh my God, what's happening? And then you've seen predictions where Prigozhin's going to knock down Putin and become the new czar of Russia, or Prigozhin's going to take over Moscow. And really what you see is a man who's like, pay attention to me. Look at how hard Wagner has fought. Look at how much people support us in Russia. So don't make us sign these contracts. Don't disband Wagner. Support us. And I think that's an important thing to remember, is why he's doing this and why he stopped before he got to Moscow. Prigozhin did not have the support on the ground, both militarily and publicly, to take over Moscow. That's not necessarily what his interests were. His interests were to show, look at the Southern Military District Command. This is why you're performing so poorly in Ukraine. Look at how easily we took it over. And no one put up a fight. All right. So I think that's what he's trying to signal, is his unhappiness, the strength of Wagner forces, the weakness of Russian forces in the South, and also to show Putin, you need us. So don't let us, be under a Ministry of Defense that clearly is not doing things correctly.
This feels like, I mean, he's sort of walking quite a tightrope, it seems to me, right? Like, because first off, like he's assuming that it's going to be super easy for him to do it. And he must have been very aware of like how many military personnel are there. I mean, that city is the sort of the departure point to Ukraine. And so he would have been through there and he would have full understanding of what's going on there, right? They wouldn't need like special intel about this. But he's got to calibrate it so that he comes off as somewhat sympathetic, it seems to me, to the Russian people or whoever. Like, who are the constituencies? Or is it just like he's trying to appeal to Putin and, slag his sort of like institutional, rivals, I guess. And he's hoping that Putin does what in the future? Like, and I'm talking, a couple of days ago when he's sitting there hatching this, what is he hoping? What does he think the outcome is going to be? That he's going to be appointed like general of the forces in Ukraine or something like that?
So yeah, that is the key question, is what was Prigozhin thinking? Because in my understanding, if you've worked on Russia as long as I have, I mean, Putin has two options to deal with this, right? And one of those includes a teapot or a window, or you live in exile. And so Prigozhin, I think his key constituency was Putin, to show him the weakness of the Ministry of Defense. And he's been complaining for months. A colleague and I were actually working on an op-ed in March about Prigozhin and how wildly he was talking about the Ministry of Defense and the general staff. But then he was quiet and we're like, oh, well, he's not talking about this anymore. But throughout, you see his complaints about not having enough supplies, not having enough guns. And we're like, is he signaling something? We're thinking about this in March. What is he signaling? And then everything happens. But I think it's also the importance to see to him is how well received Wagner forces were in Rostov in particular. I mean, you see the videos on Russian social media, on Telegram, where people are upset that they're leaving and going back to Ukraine, and they're cursing and yelling at the police in Rostov and saying, you're traitors. Like, why'd you make Wagner go away? So I think the idea was show the state, show Putin how important we are, but also show Russian people, we're fighting for you. We're upset at how poorly we're doing in Ukraine as well. Now, after the fit is over and Prigozhin's supposed to be exiled in Belarus, he released a video, like a voice message on Telegram this morning, essentially repeating what he had said, that this is about, Ukraine. We were not traitors to Russia. We never wanted to hurt the Russian war effort. And so if you're Prigozhin, it's like, okay, if you're going to be in exile in Belarus, they're alleging that they're building massive Wagner camps already in Belarus. But the question becomes, what have you done? Because what you have shown Putin is that you are not trustworthy. Not only are you not trustworthy, you're a liability. And when you're a liability to Putin, you tend to be poisoned or fall out of a window or disappear.
Well, that's the thing I'm curious about, because isn't Lukashenko the president of Belarus, Putin's biggest ally, right? Like, so why would Prigozhin be safe in Belarus, and why would that be the place that he flees? That seems to be a very precarious position for him to be in.
So I think this is where I tap into my conspiracy theory brain a little bit. So if you are Prigozhin, you have a family, you have children, and a lot of the higher ranking Wagner members also have families and children. So if he is in Belarus, Lukashenko can keep an eye on him. But if you think about where else can he go? You can't go to Africa because a lot of people hate you there. You can't go to the Middle East because you'll easily be found. You certainly can't go to the West because of the sanctions. So he has very limited options to where he can hide. So if you go to Belarus, you get to stay safe, allegedly, but you also can kind of monitor Wagner forces, but also monitor the safety of your family and your relatives. So I think that was the only option he had.
You mean you're close enough, they're in close proximity enough to Russia? Because there was a story in the Telegraph today, and I don't know how much I trust the Telegraph, that said he got a call on his way to Moscow saying, incidentally, we know where your family lives. But you would think a guy who was head of a mercenary group about to stage a mutiny that I don't want to be misunderstood, or whatever it is that he thought he was doing, would have probably said I think the fact that I have family just living wherever they're living to be a little bit of a liability maybe I should send, I mean, the guy has to have command. Like, he's wealthy, right? Like, he's got to have command of a small, I would imagine, private jet that could fly into wherever his, outskirts of wherever his family live and get them all on a plane and send them, I don't know, I mean, would it be impossible for his family to land anywhere and get out of the country? Or would that have hurt his attempt to be just like, I'm just doing this for you, Putin? Like, it seems like a pretty bold and big move to just sort of, get somebody's attention.
It is. It's hard to figure out, but I've never ran my own mercenary group, so maybe I don't understand mercenary thinking. But the saying, there are worse things than death. There are worse things than death, and the FSB can probably do all of them. And so I think, the Telegraph, take it or leave it. But I was thinking, why would he stop? But also, who can they get to? And I think the family is a good way to get to him because of the sanctions. His, a lot of his assets are frozen. His private jets have been down for a while. He hasn't had access to his yacht. There's so few places your family can go, where at least if you're in Belarus, you're close to Russia. You can make sure your family, extended family can also be safe, but also Putin can keep an eye on you and you can show him that you're loyal. That's what Prigozhin is going to have to do if he wants to stay alive. He has to show his loyalty and he needs to come up with something big for Putin, but he'll never be trusted again. And I think that's something like he had to have understood that he will never be trusted again.
I mean, it sounds like he thought that he wasn't being trusted anyway. So he must have there must have been some indication he was on the wrong list.
It's the contracts, I think. I think it's the contracts and wanting to put Wagner under the MOD. I think that was the signal to him that he needed to do something or he was going to lose single-handed control of Wagner. I think that's the key to why we see him behaving this way. But also, I think it's one of the reasons why he's not out of a window yet, honestly.
It's because if he goes away and there's no other, I mean, that's almost like his insurance card too. I'm the only one who can control this band of 25,000 mercenaries. And it's one thing if they're put under the auspices of the regular army, I guess, and then there's a command structure there. But as long as that doesn't happen, I'm the only one. And I guess I would also be looking around at the table for my lieutenants to seeing who's texting who when we have our meetings or something.
That also seems quite tenuous.
I would be a little bit nervous about, the guys I've been hanging out with and how much authority they have.